Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to rise in opposition to the Greens bill, the Galilee Basin Coal Prohibition Bill. I start my contribution by saying that as a regionally based senator in Victoria, I am incredibly concerned about what bills like this may do, of course, if they were ever passed, and this doesn't look like there's any prospect of that, but what they may do in terms of undermining jobs in our resources sector and in the mining sector in particular. In opposing coal mining in the Galilee Basin, the Greens are putting at risk around 1,500 direct jobs and almost 7,000 supporting jobs at the Adani Carmichael mine. These are real families and communities which depend on a strong and viable resources industry. As I say, this could well be the first of a number of bills from the Greens to totally shut down and abolish mining in Australia. This is an industry which generates $279 billion. These are the 2018-19 figures, with coal itself generating some $70 billion. The Greens' policies will put at risk nearly 14,000 people employed during construction of the mines and associated rail projects, more than 11,000 people employed in ongoing roles in the mines and supporting infrastructure, and $34 billion invested in bringing the mines into production, as well as new infrastructure, including rail infrastructure. The coal industry contributes more than $6 billion annually in royalties across Australia and accounts for over 50,000 direct jobs, with the majority of those jobs in regional areas. Now, of course, this is quite ironic. It comes at a time when the Labor Party has announced its net zero emissions so-called plan by 2050, which, as I have already said publicly this morning, is not a plan but a slogan. It's unfunded, uncosted, and it appears, I think Australians have every right to feel pretty confused about where Labor sits at the moment. On one hand, they're talking about zero emissions with no consideration about the economy-wide impact that that might have, particularly the impact that that might have on coal, steel, aluminium and other extractive industries. So no consideration of the broader ramifications, but of course they're talking about this so-called plan, or as I say, slogan, without any plan whatsoever. It's uncosted, it's unfunded. And so, as I say, Australians have every right to be very confused about Labor's position, because Labor's reliance and alliance on and with the Greens continues to threaten Australia's coal industry, which is a key pillar of our economy, which provides cheap and secure electricity, jobs and funds vital services. And it talks about energy security, including with gas and coal, and yet we have a situation in Victoria where the Victorian Labor government continues its moratorium on onshore conventional gas. It's okay to extract the gas offshore, the same gas in the same basin, but not onshore. And this is an extraction and exploration that does not require fracking, so that needs to be put to rest, that particular contention that some make. So we have a situation where Labor is actively operating to destabilise the energy market in Victoria, including by encouraging the shutdown of Hazelwood. So depending on who you talk to in the Labor Party, you hear a different story. There is a huge internal war going on in the Labor Party. The Otis Group, of course, has one view, and then there's others on the left who have a very different view. So, for instance, Mr Fitzgibbon, he lauds the prospects for Australia's clean and efficient coal on the back of demand in China and India. And then other Labor MPs have repeatedly opposed or undermine the Adani project and the opening up of the Galilee Basin for coal mining. And it's extraordinary. We heard from Senator Sterle speaking in very supportive terms about Adani, and yet that's in stark contrast to what we heard leading up to the election, when many Labor MPs, including the former Leader of the Opposition, Mr Shorten, were condemning Adani. And then, of course, there's Mr Miles, the member for Corio, Labor's Deputy Leader, who argued that it was a good thing that the thermal coal market would collapse. So here we are, Mr Miles continuing to ignore the continued demand for thermal coal, especially in the developing economies of Asia. And then we have another very different story here in the chamber today. I also want to place on record that the member for Highmarsh, Mr Butler, the Shadow for Climate Change and Energy, said developing the Galilee Basin is not in Australia's interests, and declared it would not be a positive thing for Australia for the Adani mine to go ahead. So, Madam Deputy President, I am not sure how that sits with the contribution that we've just heard from Senator Sterle, but it does reinforce the position that Labor is all at sea when it comes to its position on coal. But I tell you what, the coal miners of Australia worked it out, and they worked it out before the last election, 55,000 of them. And they worked it out whether you work in a coal mine, whether you work in industry, in heavy industries, whether you work as a manufacturer. They worked out that Labor deserted them in the lead-up to the last election. Their policies were totally contrary to the needs of many blue-collar workers in Australia. They've worked out that the only party standing up for them is the Liberal and National parties. And it's a bit of a joke when you hear contributions from Senator Sterle after what we have heard in recent months. Of course, the Leader of the Opposition went to the north of Sydney and talking about, up to Brisbane and saying one thing up, one there, and one story in the north of Queensland, and then another a very different story when he went down to Melbourne. So we very much condemn this bill, and I just want to also place on record that our government is working extremely hard to drive down emissions, which is having substantial success, including, and this is the Energy Security Board, including delivering renewable investment as a proportion of total energy of 40% by 2030. So last year, 16% of supply came from renewables. By 2022, it will be 27%, and by 2030, it will be 40%. So very substantial investment is going into renewables, driving our renewable energy industry, driving down emissions, but also not in a way that will be economy-wrecking and that will undermine our coal and gas industries, which are very important for our entire energy security. I thank the chamber for the opportunity to speak on this bill, and I again reiterate our opposition to this bill. Thank you.
Thank you.